America, mysticism, and the occult. He is a writer in residence at the New York Public Library, and a lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. He is the author, he's a PEN Award-winning author of a number of books, including Occult America, One Simple Idea, and The Miracle Club. Perhaps one of his most, well, for many years, he was vice president and executive editor at Penguin Random House, and perhaps one of his greatest claims to distinction is that he's been censored by the Chinese government. So anyway, I will welcome Mitch. Maybe you want to wait another minute while I admit a couple more people, but I think we're pretty good and probably ready to go. And really pleased to have Mitch here, and appreciate his taking the time to be with us today. So I'll let you take it, Mitch.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank all of you for being here, and the Scoville Memorial Library and Lawrence Davis Hollander for sponsoring events like this during this period of lockdown. I think it's wonderful that we're able to get together for an afternoon and exchange ideas. And of course, I hope, as I know all of you do, that we'll be able to do these kinds of things face to face, hopefully in the coming months. I certainly hope by a year hence, we'll all be together again in the same room. But I am very glad to be able to make this presentation, and I'm very glad to be able to make it in connection to a library that is in very close physical proximity to the area that I'm going to be talking about, which is the burned over district of central New York State, which in many regards is connected by a very large branch to the Hudson Valley itself and the surrounding environs. In a certain sense, if the burned over district, as I'll talk about, was a psychic highway, as it's been called, that spread various occult and progressive and esoteric ideas, first throughout America and then throughout other parts of the world, the Hudson Valley and the immediately surrounding environs were also a kind of great artery of this psychic highway that brought its ideas to New York City, other cities and areas along the eastern seaboard, New Jersey, Rhode Island, obviously Connecticut, and from these great ports, many of these ideas spread out across the world. And in a very real sense, I'm not talking today about a region so much as I'm talking about an idea. And it was an idea that took birth within this area, this snaking long stretch of land that was bordered, roughly speaking, by Albany in the east and Buffalo in the west, that came to be referred to in the mid 19th century as the burned over district. It was for probably about a generation in the early 19th century, the springboard, the birthplace, the womb of everything that was considered radical and avant-garde and revolutionary in both religious thought and in social thought. And it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe driving through the burned over district today on what is today Route 20, which used to be a carriage path that extended from Boston through New York State and eventually became US Route 20. What may still be the longest continually running road in the United States, which ends out west in Eugene, Oregon. This wonderful, extraordinary snaking piece of land in central New York State, maybe just about 30 miles wide, as I alluded, became just a birthplace for an extraordinary range of thought movements and religions, including Mormonism, including Seventh-Day Adventism, including, in many respects, suffragism, American utopianism, spiritualism, or talking to the dead, Shakerism. It popularized mediumship, mesmerism, a whole wide range of philosophies that are known to us today under different names like channeling or things of that nature. And these things didn't necessarily have their birth exclusively to the burned over district, but they were reformulated in ways that became digestible to vast numbers of people in the burned over district, which is why I entitled this short talk, American Sinai. It was almost as if this was the place where the tablets were received that would redefine American religion and eventually, in many regards, world religion, at least as demarcated by the revolutions in alternative spirituality all across the globe. I first really came in contact with the Burned Over District when I was very young, and I was serving an internship at a newspaper in Syracuse, New York, which is right in the heart of the Burned Over District. Although at that time, I had some threadbare understanding of the place's significance artistically and spiritually, but I really didn't have a full awareness or understanding of what this entity was, and I wouldn't until I began to work in earnest on my first book, Occult America, which came out in 2009. And when I was working on Occult America, I experienced a surprising change of mind about something. And I always feel a book is never really successful unless its author comes to change his or her mind about something during the writing of the book. If we write exactly what we started out intending to, we're probably to some greater or lesser degree victims of preconception or prejudice. I think that the process of writing a book should be as much a revelation as should be the process of reading it. It's a kind of participatory exercise. And when I first envisioned and began writing Occult America, my impression was probably that I was going to be spending a lot more time writing about the role of the state of California in the development of alternative spiritual philosophies in America. And I do write a great deal about California in the book, as California, starting in the early 20th century, underwent an economic boom and a migratory boom that made it into the engine or the birthplace of many, many novel and important movements in modern life, including what we today would refer to by the vast term alternative spirituality. But it was really the Burned Over District, this region of central New York State, this region that was related to the Hudson Valley and some of the other coastal states of the Northeast, that served, as I alluded, as this extraordinary birthplace. And I was shocked, in a sense, when my research kept taking me back there again and again and again. Freemasonry, spiritualism, Shakerism, Mormonism, suffragism, Seventh-Day Adventism, Onitism, biblical communism. All of these movements and more first began to emerge on the American spiritual scene and later the world spiritual scene from this beautiful, pristine region of central New York that, if you drive through it today, as I'm sure some of you listening have, you'll be surprised is relatively untouched. Of course, there are highways, there's intermittent sprawl, there's the, intermittent mass shopping plaza, parking lot, and so forth and so on. But the green rolling hills, the lush, beautiful farmland, the pristine lakes, particularly the Finger Lakes in the center of the state, in many regards, these things look to us today as they might have looked to settlers who flooded into the area just after the Revolutionary War. For those of you who have driven through the Burned Over District, you know that there are vistas that are so beautiful, the rolling hills, the greenery, the lakes shimmering in valleys below you in sunlight, that there are drivers, myself included, who will just almost stop in traffic and, turn their heads to take in these magnificent, rich vistas. It's some of the most beautiful country I've personally seen outside of Provence in southern France. On a beautiful spring day, on a beautiful sultry summer day, walking through a vineyard in the Burned Over District, walking through a vineyard in central New York State, I mean, you can feel like you're passing through a vineyard in the most beautiful parts of Provence. It's a magical area, if I can wax metaphorically, in terms of its landscape. Maybe it's a magical area in terms of more than just its landscape. Since next week, the Scoville Memorial Library is hosting a talk on UFOs, which I roundly applaud, maybe I'm permitted to speak a little more esoterically and a little more personally. As I mentioned, when I was doing my research into my first book, I was struck by how I kept coming back again and again and again to this beautiful stretch of land, which I've just described. And there's two different aspects to this story. One is what happened there, and the other is why it happened. And I think I'll probably start first with what happened, because that's really what we're here for today. And what happened is that this beautiful area of central New York State was, for centuries, home to the Iroquois nation, particularly the Seneca, but other tribes as well. And the colonial government of the nascent republic, the not yet born United States, along with land speculators, had long had its eye on central New York State as a place that could be open to speculation, to settlement, to agriculture. And the Iroquois, the Seneca in particular, made a star-crossed military alliance with the British during the War of Independence. And following the war, with the colonists triumphant, it gave the new colonial government the pretext that it wanted to do what it had hungered for a long time, which was to push the Iroquois out of central New York State and open it to land settlement and speculation. It did not entirely push the Iroquois, which was an umbrella of about 5 tribes, out of central New York State. There are various Indian nations that are in central New York State to this day, but it did engage in a wholesale disbursement, largely of the Seneca and other nations out west. And when the burned over district was open to resettlement and land speculation, there was a vast flood of relatively liberal New Englanders who came flowing into this newly opened farmland. And when they got there, of course, most of them had no idea of the Indian lives, Native American lives that had been extinguished from the soil. And to them, this was just extraordinary, rich, beautiful, relatively inexpensive farmland. And the call went out that if you were a farmer or a merchant, which is really the jobs that were largely available in Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, this place, was a Eden awaiting development. And so lots of families, lots of individuals left behind their ties, their childhood churches, their congregations, their familial ties, and ventured down the so-called psychic highway, ventured down this carriage path, later to be known as Route 20, into central New York State, and began to populate it. Now, what happens when you have these vast migratory flows is that people leave behind, as I was alluding, a lot of ties that they had back home, including religious ties. And so the burned over district not only became a place that was attractive to people who were looking for their own parcel of land, who were looking to make their way in the world, but it became a place where you could find new congregants, new audiences, new constituencies. And that supposedly, although no one really knows for sure, is how the burned over district got its name. There were circuit riding ministers who would crisscross throughout New England and central New York State looking for congregants or looking for crowds that they could address. And according to legend, one minister said to another who was intent on venturing into central New York State, don't bother going there. That place has been burned over. That there's nothing left there to reap or harvest. Everybody belonged to some metaphysical club or church or society or spiritualist group or something, so that was the view. According to another iteration of how the burned over district got its name, it was burned over by the fires of the spirit. Again, it was a place that you could not only find a new constituency, where you could not only find large numbers of people who had left behind their congregations, but land was cheap. So new spiritual groups that wanted to get a foothold could afford to purchase land there. So for example, one of the most famous new religious movements in America were the Shakers, which was a community that actually began in Manchester, England, several years before the Revolutionary War. They were a group of radical Quakers. They were known as the Shaking Quakers. They would pray with such fervency, and they would be occupied by higher spirits, divine energies, out-of-body elementals, that they would shake and gesticulate while they were praying. So they came to be known as the Shaking Quakers. And they were under the leadership, roughly speaking, of a spiritual visionary, young woman named Mother Ann Lee. And Mother Ann, who grew up in Manchester, England, experienced persecution, jailing. She was accused of witchcraft. Quakerism as a religion underwent a fair amount of persecution in Britain. So there were various Quakers, including very prominent figures like William Penn, very wealthy person, who ventured to America and under a royal land grant was able to found what became the state of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, as he fashioned it. The idea being that people would be able to worship freely there, not necessarily vote freely, not necessarily live freely, but worship freely. And Mother Ann was in many ways the polar opposite of a figure like William Penn. She was poor. She came from tough economic circumstances in a very grimy, gritty industrial town, and she was being persecuted for her religious faith. So she and a handful of followers, there was probably just about 8 of them at the time, made a very, very dangerous journey across the Atlantic and came to New York City in 1775. And in New York in 1775, Mother Ann and her followers worked menial jobs. They cleaned houses, they cleaned chimneys, they cleaned chamber pots. These were hardcore working people. And eventually they scrimped together enough money so that in 1776, they were able to make the journey up the Hudson and purchase a piece of land outside of Albany, New York, as others were doing. And they founded a settlement in what was then called the village of Niskayuna, which is now today more commonly referred to as Watervliet. And Mother Ann and her small band, which had grown to about 12 people, founded this religious commune, the first Shaker village, just outside of Albany in the village of Niskayuna. It's the remnants of that village are still there today. You can visit it. Mother Ann is buried there. And in a certain sense, that was the opening bell of the burned over district. That was the beginning of the burned over district as a kind of religious center in American life, because the idea that you could found a religious commune, that you could found a religious order without the approbation of any government authority or recognized church was a very, very exciting prospect to people back in the old world, exciting enough so that some of them were willing to risk their lives to cross the Atlantic in order to do this. And people heard about these little villages and communes. They visited them. After a couple of very, very tough winters, Mother Ann's commune was visited by 2 men from the town of New Lebanon, New York, another burned over district town, a little further south. But they were able to break through an early winter thaw in the early 1780s. And they visited Mother Ann's commune, returned to New Lebanon, and founded the second Shaker village in New Lebanon. And other villages popped up, eventually as far north as Maine and as far south as Kentucky. And people were fascinated with Mother Ann and this little commune in the wilderness that she had created and how they had been able to survive in these very adverse frontier conditions that really did prevail even in central New York State just after the Revolutionary War. Now, in the nearby state of Rhode Island, there was another female religious leader, one of the first publicly recognized female religious leaders probably in the modern world, a young woman also who grew up on a Quaker farm named Jemima Wilkinson. And Jemima, also in 1776, a revolutionary year in ways more than we understand, Jemima was very swept up in the excitement of what was known as the Great Awakening, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. The Great Awakening was a Baptist revival that swept through New England and New York State, New Jersey. And there was a very charismatic minister named George Whitefield. And George Whitefield in 1776 was making his last swing through New England. There were several different phases to the so-called Great Awakening. I mean, it was a revival tour, but it was a revival tour that went on for a number of years. So this was the last great wave of the Great Awakening, at least as hosted by George Whitefield. And Jemima was profoundly excited with the ideas that he presented. You know, Whitefield could speak in such a way that he would make the struggle between good and evil, the stakes between salvation and damnation, feel as palpably real as the physical environment around you. And people would drink in Whitefield's words and feel a sense of meaning and renewal and possibility. And Jemima was very excited by this. She was a young woman, only about 25 years old at the time, reasonably well educated, came from a fairly prosperous family. And she took to her room and she would feverishly read scripture, trying to understand the more arcane books like Revelation. And she would pore over signs and symbols and prophecies and numbers. One day in October of 1776, Jemima was struck with typhus fever, a wave of which was passing through New England at the time. And she took to her bed and she was in a coma for about 36 hours straight. And she was sort of shaking back and forth in fever dreams, muttering to herself. And her family thought for sure that she was going to die. And there was a priest waiting nearby to deliver, minister waiting nearby to deliver last rites. And then she sprung up from her bed after 36 hours in this kind of fever dream state. And she declared to her shocked family who were sitting in vigil around her bedside that the woman that they knew as Jemima had died. And the woman, the figure standing before them now, was an embodiment of the divine spirit in flesh form, and would answer only to the name Public Universal Friend. And so as the Public Universal Friend, Jemima began to travel throughout New England, delivering speeches and homilies and sermons. She was one of the very, very few people who was actually capable of crossing battle lines between colonial and British troops. She represented a branch of new spirituality that was very different from the Shakers. The Shakers, who were busy establishing their community outside of Albany, they were always under lots of suspicion from local authorities because, first of all, they were poor folk. Jemima came from a more prosperous background, not wealthy, but well-to-do. And the Shakers were also pacifists. So they refused any participation whatsoever in the war effort. And as such, they were viewed as possibly being British spies or British fifth columnists. They were accused of driving sheep into British territory, and local authorities did not like the Shakers. But Jemima's movement, even though it was more overtly radical in certain ways, I mean, here was this woman calling herself the Public Universal Friend and claiming to be an avatar of God. Her movement drew people who tended to be better established, more well-heeled. Some of the names in her movement, including the name Ingraham, are very well known in American life today. And Jemima, although her name is not widely remembered today, although maybe that's changing a little bit, she provided Americans with something extraordinary, which was for most people, this was the very first time they saw a woman delivering a political or a social or a religious talk in public. She struck a note that had not really been seen in public before. And her followers, who considered her an avatar of God, thought, hey, we've heard about the Shaker movement, so we should establish our own commune for our avatar, just as the Shakers did for Mother Ann Lee. So they moved into central New York State, and outside of Lake Keuka, near a town that is today known as Penyan, they established their own village, which they somewhat portentously called Jerusalem, which still exists in central New York today, along with a mansion that they built for their avatar, the public universal friend. And they helped to settle that particular region of New York State. And they began to acclimate people, as did Mother Ann, to the idea that female voices could serve as religious leaders of a certain sort, Now, I'm going to jump ahead for a moment historically before I pan backwards, because I want to stay with this theme. This is a very important social spiritual theme that developed first in the burned over district, then in other parts of American life, then in other parts of the world. This notion that women could serve as religious leaders. First, we have Mother Ann, then we have Jemima, the public universal friend. You know, it began to sort of seep into the groundwater of life in the burned over district. It wasn't something that was unheard of, as it had been in many respects back in the old world. Remember, this is very, very early on. You know, we're talking about in the birth of the nation as a republic. So there were a number of incidents that started to crop up, mostly starting in the Hudson Valley, but in other parts of the general area, including New Jersey, including parts of Rhode Island, where Americans began to experiment with a philosophy that some of you have heard of called mesmerism. We today would probably refer to it as hypnotism. And it was, at that time, a kind of occult healing art that was minted by a Swiss Viennese lawyer named Franz Anton Mesmer, who entered Paris in 1778 and began to promulgate the idea that he could place people into these kind of trance states from which he could realign this etheric animating fluid that ran through all of life, this invisible, vivifying, life-giving fluid, which he referred to as animal magnetism. And Mesmer's gambit, his theory, his idea, was that if you were experiencing a physical or a psychological malady, it was because your animal magnetism was out of balance. And that if you could be placed into this mesmeric trance state, or what later came to be called a hypnotic trance, your animal magnetism could be realigned. Now, with the advent of the French Revolution, the progress of mesmerism was stalled in France and other parts of Europe. But again, some of these ideas began to trickle across the Atlantic, and Americans began to experiment with mesmerism in ways that probably even its original founder had not fully foreseen or expected. So you had folk up and down the Hudson Valley in particular who were experimenting with these mesmeric trances. And they found, according to diaries and letters and articles, that if they could enter into a mesmeric trance, sometimes they could travel ethereally out of body to places they had never seen, speak languages they had never learned, engage in extraordinary healings, visit other realms. There was a young man named Andrew Jackson Davis who grew up as a cobbler's apprentice, again, poor family, in the town of Poughkeepsie, New York. And Andrew had a particular talent for going very deep into these mesmeric trances. And he said that when he was in this magnetized state, He was able to visit other dimensions and realms, and he would come back and he would dictate these cosmological lectures from other realms and planes of reality. And Andrew said that he had visited heaven, he had visited the afterlife. And in heaven, in the afterlife, he encountered all kinds of different people, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, or Mohammedans, as he put it, vanquished Native American tribes. And this was very exciting and arousing to people because it was a spiritual vision, yes, but it was also a social vision, because implicit in what Andrew was saying is that salvation did not just belong to any one people. It wasn't just the product of the Protestant church. Catholics were in heaven, Jews were in heaven, Native Americans were in heaven, people from different lands and reaches of time were in heaven. So without saying so explicitly, Andrew was challenging the idea that the salvific role of religion belonged to just one doctrine or congregation. This is where you start to see social changes, spiritual changes entering into the public mind, because these figures were sensational figures. They were written about, they were interviewed, they were talked about. The press would sort of make fun of Andrew Jackson Davis, and they referred to him as the Poughkeepsie Seer. And it was meant to poke fun at him. You know, who is this kid, this cobbler's apprentice from a poor family in Poughkeepsie, of all places, that, you know, thinks he's some sort of biblical prophet. But Andrew liked the name, and even though it was meant to poke fun at him, he began to use it. And you'll note again that some of these figures that we're talking about, they came from the lower economic strata of society. I mean, they certainly had a vast and a great deal more social movement and freedom than anything that could be claimed by enslaved people, vanquished Native American people, people who were living in bondage. So I'm speaking relatively, of course, but some of these folks were working folk. And it began to imbue Americans little by little with the idea that everyday people could pierce the veil that separated us from the unseen world, and that prophecy just didn't belong anymore to biblical antiquity, but maybe was right here in this new American Israel, as some people refer to the new nation, was right here in central New York State, in the Hudson Valley, in New Jersey. That's why the name the Poughkeepsie Seer was so kind of exciting to people in a certain way. So it's hard to understand fully how an idea, even today, goes viral. But sometimes one person has an experience and it trips a certain switch, and the experience starts to form a network of roots, and other people start to have the same experience. And this is what returns us to the heart of the Burned Over District and the narrative thread that I was developing earlier. With news of mesmerism and spirit trances and out-of-body experiences kind of hanging in the air, something extraordinary happened in the Burned Over District in the winter of 1848 that would change the world. And see if you think I'm exaggerating. There was a small log cabin occupied by a Methodist family by the name of Fox outside of Rochester, New York, in the town of Hydesville. And the Fox family had three young daughters, including two adolescent daughters, Kate and Margaret Fox. And in a very tough, cold winter of 1848, Kate and Margaret told their shocked parents that the bangs and the raps and the noises that were being heard throughout the family cabin were spirit raps, were communications with beings from the other world. And the two adolescent girls told their shocked Methodist parents, that they had worked out a code, a system of bangs and raps whereby they could communicate with spirits from the unseen world. And these claims from these two adolescent girls spread very quickly, and different reporters, clergy, judges, scientists descended upon the Fox family home to test the claims, and many of them, including the newspaper editor Horace Greeley, including a state Supreme Court judge, came away with the opinion that the girls were telling the truth, and that the Fox sisters, these two young kids, had in fact, through a series of bangs and raps, worked out a kind of spiritual telegraph system with the afterlife. And thus was born the movement known as spiritualism. And Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer, who, while not directly part of the burned over district, was living in one of its arteries, the Hudson Valley, Andrew was ready. As soon as news spread of the Fox sisters' ability to contact the spirit world, Andrew said, aha, there's a term, there's a word that was used by Mesmer, the occult healer, for his sittings, his sessions. And that term was seance. And Andrew, in the early 1850s, in response to the Fox sisters, issued instructions, very clear, illustrated instructions, whereby Americans who wanted to have the same experience as the Fox sisters could organize themselves into seance circles and join hands around tables and summon the spirits. And thus was born the movement of spiritualism, with seance circles, clubs, newspapers, lecture societies. Starting in the early 1850s, this movement spread all across America. And it spread with great rapidity. And one might ask, why? Why did this movement grow so quickly embraced, to the point where, I've crunched the numbers as best as I'm capable, and I would warrant for real that probably in the mid 1850s, about 10% of Americans were practicing spiritualism. Think of it, 10%. Small country at the time, but that's a large fraction of people to be engaged in what we today would consider an occult thought movement. Why did it spread so rapidly and so fully and so completely? I think there are many reasons, but one of the reasons that I'm always struck by is that, as I was alluding earlier, and as I think emerged as a very compelling theme from the burned over district, people were really enthralled with the fact that this spirit rap phenomena started with these two young adolescent girls, Kate and Margaret Fox. And I think many Americans who read about these things in newspapers and pamphlets, these people were known, news traveled, including back to Europe. Many Americans were enthralled with the idea that these two kids from a log cabin in central New York State in a little town called Hydesville could apparently, if one believed a great figure like Horace Greeley, or one believed, Supreme Court justices or others who went to investigate them, they could pierce the veil. And Americans in the best kind of do-it-yourself spirit began to think, well, look, maybe I don't need the man in the robes with the bells and the incense and so forth, speaking from high up on a lectern somewhere to pierce the veil for me, to be my guide. Maybe I can do this myself at my kitchen table, in my parlor, or as part of a club. And look, Andrew Jackson Davis, this Poughkeepsie seer, this kid, he started his career at age 17. Poor kid, cobbler's apprentice, came from a hard scrabble farming family in the Hudson Valley. That's not so different from me. This doesn't seem so far away. This seems possible. This seems plausible. The very fact that these figures were not in their personas exotic figures, but were familiar kind of figures, ordinary kind of figures, was very powerful and very exciting to people. And of course, there were other dimensions as well. It's poignant in terms of today's experience. Lives were claimed by infectious diseases at terrible, terrible rates. I think it was in 1852 in New York City, more than half of all deaths that particular year were infant-based. Infants were dying of smallpox and whooping cough, tuberculosis, various childhood diseases. And the grief under which people lived was staggering. But there was no therapeutic spirituality at that time within Calvinistic Protestantism, and just, the general state of things economically and socially. There weren't really periods of mourning exactly. There weren't periods in which, people would be subjected to a gentler treatment. A funeral would be held and it would be back to work the next day. And it was a brutal, brutal way of life that I think we don't know and don't understand today. There was no one to comfort anyone. And if a mother in a household lost a child, she was alone, during the day. She maybe had other kids around who needed care, but her husband was off in the fields or was off at the mill or whatever his business was. There was church on Sunday, but that was it. People didn't have the social ties and so forth. They were very isolated, and the grief must have been staggering. The Seance movement, it's very hard for modern people to understand this today, but the Seance movement provided solace. It was in many regards one of the first expressions of therapeutic spirituality, which is a hallmark today of the alternative spiritual culture. It helped people find meaning. The idea that you could sit around a seance table and maybe make contact with a loved one said that your love was enduring in some regards. Your relationship was enduring. Whatever was happening, whatever was going on, the therapeutic effect was evident enough. We know this from letters and testimony and articles, and I think that's probably among the reasons why this movement grew. But when spiritual movements grow, when any kind of thought movement grows, there's always remarkable and unexpected consequences. And here is one of the greatest and most remarkable and most epic from the spiritualist movement, which is why I say without qualification that it changed the world. As occurred a generation earlier with Mother Ann and with Jemima Wilkinson, the public universal friend, something really remarkable unfolded very, very early on in the history of spiritualism. Most spirit mediums were women. And spiritualism as a movement developed and grew, as I was alluding, into newspapers, newsletters, clubs, lecture societies, eventually even a network of churches. Hence, spiritualism as an organized movement gave women the opportunity arguably for the very first time in modern history to serve as religious leaders of a certain sort. Mother Ann was a unique, iconic figure. The public friend was a unique, iconic figure. But spirit mediums, they were suddenly part of a structure, a group, an occupation. And most of them were women. So any woman who wanted a voice within the civic or religious culture could, in many cases, find that voice within spiritualism. It is no accident that likewise in the year 1848, the same year that the Fox sisters in effect created modern spiritualism in the burned over district outside of the city of Rochester, about 50 miles down the road, the same year, there occurred the Seneca Falls Conference for Women's Rights. It's not accidental. There was a period of time for about a generation, maybe more, in the 19th century, where you could not find a spiritualist who had not spent, you could not find a suffragist, rather, who had not spent some time at the seance table, and fairly vice versa. Most people, most especially women, most especially mediums, who spent time at the seance table were also involved in the suffragist movement. The two were intertwined like a strand of DNA. It was a remarkable historical confluence, and it was not incidental. Susan B. Anthony, later in life, considered herself, spiritually speaking, a kind of free thinker and most probably an atheist. She was a secular figure in her adulthood, later in life. One of her chief friends and collaborators, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leaned more in the direction of spirituality. She was more of a spiritual adventurer. But early in both women's careers, both women's political careers, they, like a great many other suffragist activists, were deeply admiring of the women, the mediums in the spiritualist movement, because they understood that these figures were giving a voice to female participation in the civic life, the religious life of the nation in ways that hadn't been possible before. And one of Susan B. Anthony's early letters to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she wrote her and told her of the agonizing shyness that she felt when she would go up to speak from a lectern. And she said with complete seriousness and complete ingenuousness, "Oh, how I wish I could be a spiritualist medium for just 2 weeks." She was being completely serious, not sardonic, because she and other suffragists looked at female mediums as these remarkable, pioneering, revolutionary figures. Again, Susan B. Anthony did not believe in spiritualism later in life. She was not religious. She was more of what we would consider humanist, secular. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was more avant-garde in questions of spirituality. So it's not as if everybody had one point of view. But early in the life of the suffragist and the spiritualist movement, there was a unique and remarkable marriage. One grew from the other. And this hasn't been fully understood in our teaching of history, and it's coming to be understood. It's coming to be understood. It also should be noted that spiritualism was, in many regards, America's very first religious export. In the early 1850s, seance circles began to pop up in the salons of Paris and London. And they were taking a cue from the American movement, even though the American movement used a French word, Mesmer's term, seance. This was a homegrown American movement that developed right along Route 20 in the burned over district. And this was, in many regards, America's first spiritual export. There were other spiritual exports that would grow out of the burned over district. New religions, vibrant, fast spreading religions, including the religion of Mormonism. The Mormon prophet Joseph Smith, he came from a family of New Englanders who migrated from Vermont into the burned over district in the early 1800s for the reasons that everybody did. They wanted new farmland. They wanted an opportunity. They wanted a way to start over. And the local legends and myths and traditions and folklore of the burned over district was a kind of lamplight in Joseph's background, in Joseph's family background. People would talk about the burned over district as this mysterious place that was maybe occupied by some ancient peoples that were older than the oldest Indian tribe and that had been wiped out in a confrontation with the Native Americans. Governor DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York State in the early 1800s, he gave a lecture in 1811 where he theorized, as Joseph later would, that there was an ancient people that occupied central New York State and that had left behind certain metallic ornaments, which he felt bore the markings of Freemasonry or Freemasonic influences. It was very tantalizing. It was very interesting. And Joseph was known in the 1820s as a kind of a local seer, a local savant who had the gift of second sight and could help people engage in treasure hunting and this kind of thing. And Joseph later told the story that In the late 1820s, he was visited by an angel who directed him to plates with an antique language on it that he was able to decipher using this kind of magical pair of goggles or eyeglasses that had been bestowed upon him, that were fashioned of stones that had been used and known to the ancient Hebrew priests. And he produced what was later known as the Book of Mormon, a New Testament of Christ, which, depending upon your point of view, you could see as either echoing or buttressing the folklore that had spread through the burned over district of there having been this ancient, biblically vintaged people that lived in this New York State area, which figured in part into the theology of the Book of Mormon. Now, Joseph would soon take his followers and venture out of central New York State and start to venture west toward Michigan, eventually, obviously, Utah. And his congregation played a massive role in the settling of the American West. Joseph didn't feel he could really find his fortunes or put down his congregational roots fully in the burned over district, where he was sometimes regarded as a figure of suspicion. It's not that life was always rosy for these new religious figures in the burned over district. Mother Ann Lee, she was a couple of generations before Joseph, but Mother Ann Lee was sometimes attacked by angry mobs, accused, as I mentioned, of being a British spy. Jemima Wilkinson was more or less left alone because she came from a higher rung of society, but there were suspicions and accusations and finger pointing. It wasn't that life was always so rosy and so easy. Tougher for Mother Ann, I would say, than most of the others who followed her, because she was, in my estimation, the real trailblazer. And she was in physical danger sometimes. Joseph was sometimes regarded with suspicion in the area, and he felt that in order for his congregation to grow, it had to expand outside the burned over district. Another congregation, which will be recognizable to everybody probably listening today, that eventually grew out of the burned over district, is the religion known as Seventh-Day Adventism. Seventh-Day Adventism had its earliest gestation with another burned over district figure, also again, who lived just outside of Rochester, named William Miller. Miller was a remarkable man who had been a soldier in the War of 1812. And obviously, he survived the war. And there was a point of view sometimes among people who survived the War of 1812. It was just something that was in the air at that time, that their survival had somehow been divinely ordained, that they had been protected in some way. And so Miller, who was a Freemason, and a Baptist by birth, came home, and he was ignited with this idea that he had somehow been divinely spared in the war. And he began to pore over scripture for signs and symbols and prophecies and understanding of why that was so. And Miller came to feel that it was possible through number symbolism and other scent trails that had been left in scripture, codes that had been left in scripture, to mathematically divine the date of Armageddon, or the date of what would be the new millennium, the return of Christ, 1,000 years of peace. And Miller identified this date. He settled upon different dates, but eventually he settled upon a date in the fall of 1843, a period of time at which he believed the world would come to an end, and the second advent basically would occur. And the movement that formed around him was known informally as the Millerites. And the Millerites would engage in enormous tent revival meetings, including one meeting where probably about 1,000 people were in attendance in a tent outside of Rochester. And there was a fierce windstorm, and the tent under which everybody was gathered was kind of blown off of its moorings like a clamshell being torn open. And nobody was killed and nobody was hurt. And it fueled this idea that somehow the movement was divinely ordained. And other things like this would go on. And eventually, the decided upon date of the new millennium in fall of 1843 came and went. And people thought, well, now the Millerites will be disappointed. Now the Millerites will be proven as products of delusion. But in fact, that did not occur. There were theological rumblings within the movement that the events that William Miller prophesied and foresaw occurred not on an earthly scale, but on a kind of cosmic scale, and foretold something that was still ahead for humanity. And as time passed, the movement itself came to be known as Seventh-Day Adventism. And again, like Mormonism, became one of the fastest growing Christian congregations, one of the fastest growing new religions to sweep across the Western world. Because our time today is brief, and I want to leave us time for an exchange before we say goodbye to one another, there are so many different personalities and personas and ideas and movements that I could talk about, and I've given you only a taste of these extraordinary figures and movements that ran through the burned over district, roughly speaking, from the end of the Revolutionary War, probably up through the 1850s. And I say the 1850s because that was a general point when these ideas were no longer local upcroppings of the burned over district, but spread throughout other parts of the country. By the 1850s, you had Shaker villages as far north as Maine, as far south as Kentucky. By the 1850s, Mormonism as a movement had begun to live out its destiny, pushing forth first into the Midwest and then into the American West, state of Utah. It was at this point that spiritualism as a movement was not only being practiced around the nation, but that was being practiced in London, in Paris. It was at this point that suffragism was no longer a movement that belonged strictly to the relatively liberal environs of the burned over district and New England, but that was spreading out, that was being heard around the world. That the idea of religious communes were no longer just tiny, tidy Shaker villages or the community founded in New Jerusalem, New York, near Lake Keuka, but these things were being felt in different parts of the country, including in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and other parts of the nation, where the idea of the religious commune, the idea of the intentional community was being felt for the first time. The most popular intentional community arguably known in the modern world was the Oneida community, also found in the burned over district, which existed as a successful commune modeled, roughly speaking, after a kind of biblical communism into the early 1880s. Probably a number of you with us today have Oneida dishware or cutlery in your home. That brand, that product came out of that commune. So the burned over district as an eminent place in American life began to fade in the 1850s, not because the movements died out, but because they became popular, because they entered the groundwater of the country, because they could be felt in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Maine, in New Jersey, in Rhode Island. They could be felt in Germany, in Paris, in France. Suddenly these movements that had been these local revolutions were now worldwide influences. So in many respects, when success comes, the original wrapper, the original husk that had surrounded the kernel of this success is discarded. Americans, in their best sense, don't really classify themselves too heavily as part of specific movements. They tend to imbibe certain ideas, especially religious ideas, and discard the outer wrapping. So you won't find a lot of people who necessarily say, I'm a spiritualist. But you would find people who might say, yeah, or today might say, well, I'm interested in channeling. I'm interested in A Course in Miracles. I'm interested in intuition. I'm interested in dream interpretation. I'm interested in psychical research, and so on and so forth. But they won't necessarily walk around with that particular label. And I think that's in some ways a healthy instinct and a positive instinct. It's not universal, but I think it's the best of who we are. I don't want to get overly attached to labels necessarily, either embracing them or running from them. And the burned over district and its movements became so successful that it was no longer local. I'll close on this note. Why? Why did all of this happen in this beautiful stretch of farmland in central New York State? Why was it the the springboard, the engine for so much that was religiously dynamic, that was socially innovative. Again, drive through the burned over district today. It's pretty untouched, relatively speaking. And you'll be hard pressed to figure out, what was it? What was it? I will say this, on a social level, and this is something to which I alluded earlier, migratory flows are extraordinary things. Demographic flows and changes, movements of peoples are extraordinary things. If you look at migratory flows in America and in other parts of the world, you will always find a map of where the new religious and social movements are coming from. When that land was opened up after the Revolutionary War, and it was tragic because there were Native American lives that had occupied that soil for centuries that were extinguished from that soil. So there's a terrible tragedy embedded within this story. But when that land opened up and New Englanders began to flow into the burned over district, they were in many respects operating without a map. They had left behind the congregations and the familial ties of their childhood. They were ripe constituents for new ideas. And when people gather into new places for the first time, and they are given a relative degree of freedom from intervention from other material laws and forces, incredible new ideas, communities, experiments, and upcroppings can emerge, can grow. And we live in a world today where there's a great deal of retrenchment. There are rising tides of nationalism, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. Our friends in England have reaffirmed Brexit. Those who support that, they have their reasons. But I will say this, the movement, the commerce of human ideas, trade, the movement of people across borders into new places, into new ideas, into new religions, into new social arrangements. It creates things that can never be foreseen, And humanity always seems to be a global community on the move. Religions have morphed and changed dramatically from antiquity to today. Social arrangements have morphed and changed dramatically, and usually those things are accompanied by great, vast human movements. There's something about the frontier that is both interior and exterior. We need new places to push into, and the burned over district gave people a new place to push into that was at once exterior and that was at once interior. And when those changes occur, the ripple effects can be absolutely extraordinary and world-changing. And that is what the burned over district was in the life of America and in the life of the world. This small place between Albany and Buffalo, where a new group of people came and they turned what was a carriage path into a great psychic highway that went on to affect the world all around us and continues to today. So I thank you so much for being here. I know we have run over a little bit, but if everybody, whoever wishes to, I'm happy to stick around and try to take a few questions. I think the questions were submitted to Lawrence, and I'm happy to engage a few. And I thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mitch. That was fascinating. Somehow I have a feeling there's a part 2 somewhere.
I'd be delighted.
Right.
Maybe even in person.
That would be wonderful too.
Yeah.
So let me read some of the questions or try to get to all of them. I think we can. And obviously people are welcome to leave as they want to. To what extent would suffragism have emerged even without the spiritualist background? Would the abolitionist movement have led to suffragism, or was abolitionism itself provoked to some extent by the spiritualist movement?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, there's a couple of different things to unpack there. Abolitionism had many different causes. There were different inlets, feeding into abolitionism. But it is important to point out there's a common theme in all of this: suffragism, abolitionism, the movements, the burned over district, and that is Quakerism. Quakerism as a movement was very vibrant and dynamic, and also persecuted within England. And so there were many Quaker folk who crossed the Atlantic and came to the American colonies. And as they came here, partly again as a result of traveling, as a result of having to set down new roots, as a result of being a religion that had a mystical orientation in which the individual was felt to really undergo experiences from the unseen world and had a kind of responsibility to the world as it was seen. Quakerism helped feed into a number of these movements, including abolitionism. Abolitionism was an actively felt movement within the burned over district and other parts of the surrounding area, including Saratoga, New York. And the question is a very interesting one. Would suffragism have emerged without spiritualism? My guess is probably so, simply because the march of the human experience is usually in the direction of greater and greater individual liberty, usually. But it's an interesting question. Would it have grown as quickly? Would it have grown as robustly? Would it have found its stock of early leaders as readily without the spiritualist experience? It's kind of like asking yourself, if I hadn't gone to that party, would I have met my spouse? Well, maybe you would have. Maybe someone else would have introduced you, but one never knows. And, you remove one leg of a table and you never know quite what's going to happen. So I presume, because of the unfolding of human history in the direction of more and more individual dignity and liberty, suffragism as a movement would have occurred. But would it have occurred as dynamically, had the same stock pool of leaders, have spread as rapidly without spiritualism? I doubt it. I think the two were very tied by a kind of destiny. There was a vitality in that tie, so one would have looked different without the other.
This one doesn't quite have a question mark in it, but I think there's a lot to it. Have you ever looked at Matilda J Gage? She was written out of suffragist history by Anthony and Stanton, who was a close collaborator with them. Gage was a self-taught scholar, not shy about her theosophy and spiritualism, wrote a book called Women, Church, and State. She was also influenced by the sovereign Haudenosaunee women, modern scholarship by Sally Wagner on their influence on her and on suffrage generally. I can only imagine that indigenous spiritual influence on Euro-American settler alternative spirituality is also very important to the burned over district.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Gage was an extremely important figure. She came a little bit later than some of the folks that I was referencing, but she was very important and emergent to some degree, not only from the movement of suffragism, but from the movement referenced as theosophy, which was a kind of radically ecumenical, mystical, occult movement that began, officially speaking, in New York City in the year 1875. And to some extent, I mentioned that the Hudson Valley was kind of like an artery connecting the burned over district to New York and to other port cities. And, you found that there was an interplay between the New York as a kind of what was then a minor metropolis, but still an important place, and the burned over district, the Hudson Valley connecting them. So the influence of theosophy, which really began in earnest in the mid 1870s here in New York City, where I'm seated, that touched Gage, and she was an extremely important figure in promulgating ideas of both mysticism and universal rights, abolitionism, suffragism. I would like to write more about her in the future.
Sort of two questions, but let me put them both out together. Any connection to the fact it was Indian land before these others, and maybe the land was higher frequency areas or energy vortexes where the veil is thinner? And did Native Americans speak to spirits and have a communications before the teenage girls' influence?
I've thought a lot about that, and I didn't get into that in our talk just because we had such a fixed period of time, but these are very burning questions, about the area. I mean, the burned over district, it really was ancient land. It was ancient territory, and it had been home to the tribes of the Iroquois Federation for centuries. And even very early in this period of settlement, I mentioned that Governor DeWitt Clinton, who lived here in Brooklyn, where I'm seated, he delivered a talk to the New York State Historical Society in 1811, where he said that there was evidence, in his estimation, of an ancient civilization that had symbols that were associated, in his mind, with Freemasonry and the Seneca Indian leader, Red Jacket. He and some of his inner circles would wear insignias that some people thought had Freemasonic elements to them. As late as 1905, State University of New York Press, SUNY Press, published a book about metallic Freemasonic ornaments among the Native Americans of New York State. And there was this feeling that there was this esoteric history there. And Smith, Joseph Smith, echoed some of this in the Book of Mormon. Again, depending on your belief system, you could say, well, hey, you know, the Book of Mormon is validating the history that was there, or you could say, hey, Joseph imbibed local history and repeated in the Book of Mormon. It all comes down to one's point of view. But that mythology, and I use that in the highest sense, that mythology was there. That mythology was there. So the presence of an uncharted antique religious history in the burned over district is a very, very real thing. To what extent that colored the history that we're talking about is a very open question. You know, not everybody had these contacts. There were social, how can I put it? There were spiritual, social antecedents, but many of the figures that I've talked about, maybe with the exception of Mother Ann, would have very, very little contact actually with the remaining Native American groups and communities in the burned over districts. There wasn't, at least we don't have a record of there being a good deal in the way of overt contact, but it's tantalizing because there is this antecedent in terms of there being this unwritten spiritual history of the burned over district.
Let's see. What about the female spiritualists arising in reaction to the earlier witchcraft trials in New England?
It's interesting, you know, you had, of course, the Salem witch trials in the 1690s. There was a witch craze, a witch hunting craze that swept through Europe for centuries that really went on much later than I think we sometimes understand. I think the last public witch trial resulting in execution that I know of in Western Europe was in Switzerland, I think in 1791. And that's kind of shocking because that's a much later date than you would think this stuff would be going on. You know, we think of European witch trials and witch hunts as playing out in the medieval period. But in fact, you know, it was shocking to me to learn that a nation, you know, as relatively prosperous as Switzerland was hosting a witch trial as late as 1781, well into what was supposed to have been known as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment. What was remarkable in my mind about the Salem witch trials here in the US is that they did not continue. It was a horrible, horrible spasm of mob violence. But it's interesting to note that unlike the European experience, these witch trials in the United States or the colonies, they didn't continue. There wasn't this ripple effect. There were upcroppings of mob violence, but nothing like Salem, where, you know, an entire region was swept up in this paranoia, this murderous paranoia, and there were dozens of casualties. That did go on in Europe. That didn't really repeat in the United States or the American colonies. And it's a tough needle to thread because I don't want to wax idealistic. There were horrible things going on at the time. Obviously, slavery, which persisted for centuries, the destruction of the Native American civilization. But there was, relative to the old world, a fair amount of what we would call religious freedom. And there weren't these upcroppings, these spasmodic acts of religious violence. There were other kinds of violence, lynchings and things that can't be emphasized enough. But the Salem witch trials as such did not unfold as this kind of revolving madness, you know, in the colonies that they did in Europe, which is kind of interesting.
I think we can take a couple more questions. Still a fair number of people here. I realize your focus was on alternative religious expression, spiritualism emerging from the burnt over district, but I'm wondering how you view Charles Finney, a Presbyterian lawyer turned evangelist. I'm wondering how Finney's new measures, revivals, help reshape a lot of traditional churches. He helped
Yeah.
with abolitionism, especially the idea of immediatism, that one had to give up the sin of slavery immediately.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, all of these religious histories, I mean, I use the term alternative spirituality to sort of demarcate a more radically ecumenical spirituality that doesn't necessarily have its home in any one congregation, but the interplay between so-called mainstream or traditional spirituality and alternative spirituality is key. So you have figures like Finney, or you have figures like George Whitefield, movements like the Great Awakening, which went in several phases, where as soon as people are sort of attracted to a certain religious vision or idea, you never know the various directions politically and spiritually that's going to go in. You know, I mean, in many ways, Jemima Wilkinson was a product of the Great Awakening. In some regards, William Miller, not exactly a first generation product of the Great Awakening, but the kind of like fervent baptism, the renewal movement, the idea of the kind of born again baptism that swept through that part of the country at that time, you know, that thrilled a figure like William Miller. So sometimes in the wake of some of these what would be considered traditionalist revivals, you have these extraordinary upcroppings. I mean, look, in many ways, Freemasonry itself, which I said very little about, was, I think, probably the most radical expression to come out of, let's say, the Reformation or the Protestant Revolution. You know, the root of Protestant, of course, being protest. The idea that power could be decentralized, that the individual could have his or her own direct experience with the higher. You know, these things were just hugely powerful ideas to people. You know, Methodist witnessing. All of these ideas gave the individual the feeling that he or she had a direct participatory role in the unseen world, in the divine, in salvation. And once you give people the idea that they have that direct participation, which we sometimes refer to as mysticism, it unleashes a tremendous amount of human agency.
There's several questions in this question, but I think you could do the short version. I'm curious as to whether these communities endured and how they were funded. Were people asked to financially support them? Did they hold property? Are there any sites to see today?
Oh, yeah, great question. Well, first of all, Jemima Wilkinson's movement, the Public Universal Friend, hers was a fairly well-to-do movement. Hers attracted some, you know, reasonably well-off merchants and farmers. And in the town of New Jerusalem in central New York State today, you can see Jemima's mansion. She died there on the grounds. I think it was in 1832. So you'll still find that mansion right there, and you can visit it and walk right up to it. The Shaker villages are still here. The Shakers were largely self-funded, and they sustained themselves in later years through the making of crafts and agriculture. And the Shakers, as many of you are probably aware, were celibate, but they would attract new members because they might take in orphans or poor folk or converts. And that began to change in the 1880s, and the Shakers began to grow smaller and smaller. There's probably a few surviving Shakers in Maine today. There were still a few Shakers in New Lebanon, New York, as early as the early 1970s. And there's now a Sufi community. Sufism being a mystical Islamic tradition. There's a Sufi community right nearby the Shaker village, and I know some people who were founders of that community. And one of them told me the story. They were hippies, you know, back in the day. When they first showed up there to found their community, there were still some elderly Shaker women living in the New Lebanon village, and they told us we've been expecting you. The spirits told us you were coming. So movements don't exactly disappear. They build one on top of the other. And of course, Mormonism is a worldwide congregation. Seventh-Day Adventism is a worldwide congregation. Spiritualism went on to many, many different directions. There's a network of spiritualist churches, although, demographically, they're pretty small today. But what we call spiritualism isn't exactly the vocabulary of life anymore. We might talk, as I was alluding earlier, about channeling or mediums or intuition or, things like that. But these movements will undergo changes in names, demography, but they endure. And sometimes they become enormous, and sometimes they're not movements anymore so much as ideas. I think spiritualism probably endured as an idea.
All right, I guess last question. Are you aware of a location or place today that has spiritual presence and attributes like the burned over district?
Interesting question. I'm always fascinated. I love the state of California. I'm always fascinated with the destiny that seems to hang over California, Northern California, Southern California. California experienced real economic boom times just after the First World War, even more so than it did in the gold rush era. And, as with the burned over district, as migratory flows centered on California, it became the engine of new religious ideas. But unlike the burned over district, it's remained so. And California is into its second century, I would say, as a kind of birthplace of new religious ideas. And a lot of friends of mine, a lot of people I know and work with have pondered this question. What is it about California? I asked the filmmaker David Lynch, and he said to me, I think it's the light. It's the light. It's the climate. It's that feeling that the climate outside is the same as the climate inside, and the light gives you the feeling that you can accomplish what you set out to do in the world. And people, it's funny, people sometimes, I'll ask people, why did they move to California? And they'll always say they're embarrassed. Well, it was the weather. And I'm so embarrassed to say that because it sounds so pedestrian. But, don't apologize for that. I always tell them, Mike Nesmith, who's a member of the band The Monkees, who's a figure that I've written about and who I like, he said, you'd be surprised the number of decisions people make in life based on the weather. So never say that the weather is just some pedestrian thing. So forgive me, I'm digressing, but there is something that hangs over the state of California that I think is ineffable, and that we've never been fully able to explain. So that's an area that I've always been personally fascinated with, and that I think endures as an engine of novelty and religious innovation today.
We've got one person who can't type in a question because she's driving. So Maren.
I see. Maren, be careful. Drive carefully.
So
I saw you were
sorry.
driving. No, it's quite all right. Don't look at me. Just,
A wild woman, literally an herbalism class that ran almost 2 hours over, so I couldn't get home in time, but I still wanted to participate. I apologize.
Audio is always an option. Yeah, welcome.
I have one question, and so I was late coming in because of that late run. Did you mention Lilydale at all, or is that a thing you're aware of? And also,
very much, yeah.
I'm one of your patrons on Patreon, and I mentioned I think that I grew up Mormon, unfortunately for me, but anyways, that's a whole other topic. My mother was from York, Pennsylvania, and she was Pennsylvania Dutch. So I've read a lot about like Pennsylvania Dutch witchcraft lately.
Oh yeah.
My mom even has stories of her visiting like a hoodoo worker.
Yes.
When she was injured as a small child, my grandfather. Anyway, sorry.
No, not at all.
But I wonder how that Pennsylvania Dutch German like kind of witchcraft and like the Long Farewell book. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, of course I am. Yeah.
That, and then I just picked up randomly recently a book called Lilydale that is. I've just read the sample, and it's really interesting so far.
Oh yeah, that's a very fine book.
I had already signed up to come and watch this, participate in this when I read that, but everything just, how it is. Like I did your 10-day challenge, and everything is just piling so fast. It's ridiculous.
Oh, well, I'm so glad you're here, and I recognize your name from Patreon, and let me I'll try to unpack a couple of those things quickly. Lilydale, of course, is the, oh, pleasure, is a very historic and still active spiritualist community outside of Buffalo, New York. Came a little later than some of the events that we were talking about. I think it was founded in 1879. It was a very popular and remains popular spiritualist
Is it
community.
a baby of the Mount Sinai burned over district?
I would say it's a first generation offspring, and
Okay.
and so you also have a spiritualist community, Casadega in Florida. There's another community, maybe it's Spencertown. I'm not remembering correctly. I'm not sure, in Indiana. There were a number of these spiritualist summer camps, at least two of which, probably three, are still surviving. And Lilydale is perhaps the most prominent, where people would go and they would spend their summer holidays, and there were spiritualist churches and activities and events and talks, kind of like what's the Chautauqua, somewhat like Chautauqua. It's like a living, learning community, but with a very explicit spiritualist bent. So yes, it's part of the burned over district life. And I would say it's probably a first generation offspring of the burned over district. The Pennsylvania Dutch history is fascinating, particularly how it intertwined with hoodoo. Hoodoo is an African-American tradition, not to be confused with voodoo, which is a proper Afro-Caribbean religion,
Right.
but hoodoo with an
Or
H is a proper is a African American spell work tradition, continues in the American South, in American cities in the Northeast, including here in New York and other areas today. Hoodoo is a wonderful, wonderful melange of different ideas, some of which were imbibed through Pennsylvania Dutch culture. Pennsylvania Dutch culture hosted a lot, maintained and continues to maintain a lot of folkloric and occultic traditions from Europe, including certain like offshoots of Kabbalah and other related things. So it's again, it's its own wonderful culture. And I could give another talk altogether on hoodoo, which would be a great pleasure.
I would enjoy that a lot.
Yeah. So it's for the future. And, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's all the questions, and I think we probably should call it a day.
Thank you. It's been an exciting time. Anybody who wants to find me, I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz. I'm on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. I'm on Patreon. You can visit my website, mitchhorowitz.com. Appreciate your spending time with me. And if you liked this, stay in touch. Lots more of events coming.
Thank you so much, Mitch.
Thank you.
Everyone for attending.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks to the Scoville Library. Lawrence, thank you. Really appreciate it.
It was great. Don't forget to send me an invoice.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, y'all. I really appreciate it. We'll do it again.
Good.
Take care. Bye. Thank you.